Greetings, this is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. This is Lansing Online News Radio with Bonnie Buckaroo and Bill Castanier. And we are recording here down at the in the basement in the bowels of LCC. For those of you who do want to watch a webcast at the same time, you can go to LansingOnlineNews.com, and we have a live webcast that's there, and it's later going to be archived on YouTube. Bill Castanier is about to join me, and one of the first things that we wanted to talk about are some of the activities coming up this weekend.
Yeah, this seems to be the weekend everything kicks off.
Okay, this is summer.
It's summer. Festival of the Moon, Festival of the Sun in Old Town is Friday, Saturday evenings. There's spectacular events. They've gotten pricey.
Oh, really?
Can we say that?
I guess we can, but we can't tell them how much.
But I just noticed it looked pricey to me.
So the price goes up every year?
Yeah, more people come, demand.
Uh-huh.
Same weekend is the Summer Solstice Jazz Festival in East Lansing. I don't believe that costs anything. It's outdoors.
Mm-hmm. So what is the story with Festival of the Moon, Festival of the Sun? Do we know any of the acts that are appearing, or?
I don't have them with me, and I'm looking at the poster, and it does not say, but if you go to festivalofthemoonandsun.com, you can find them.
Okay.
But they didn't, obviously, when they did their poster, they did not have somebody confirmed. They're great events, there's no question about it. And they take like
beer tent, and you can sit out there and listen to music.
Wine tasting. And they're right at the foot of Turner Street.
Yeah.
And they've gotten very large. Also,
where is the event in East Lansing? Where do they hold that? Is that at Valley Court?
That's in Albert, right.
Oh, it's at Albert.
Albert, yep.
Oh, okay, that's not Valley Court.
And then Ann Street Plaza, there's some. So it's all around. It's Pepino's. That's at 213 Ann. There's a lot in Albert Avenue. The Broad is doing some things. So basically, East Lansing's got a lot going on.
So those are the same nights?
The 20th and 21st, right?
Okay.
Exactly, same nights,
wow.
Which doesn't seem to work. I mean, it's not that big.
They're kind of similar, aren't they?
I don't think you have alcohol at the one.
Ah, well, that's a big
The
difference.
one in East Lansing?
Right. I'm pretty sure there's no alcohol out there. And that's what makes Festival of Moon and Sun work. And they also, I think they pay probably their overhead with these two single events. They've come pretty close.
They've become very popular over the years. I'm eager, if anybody out there is an eager beaver photographer, we'd love to see some photos. We'd put them up on Lansing Online News.
They're always colorful.
Yeah.
And then also this week is WKAR at their studio is having a program Wednesday at 7 p.m. that the public's invited to. It's I always forget if we can say that word free. We can't.
We're not supposed to.
But
well, let's just say you could leave your wallet at home and be all right.
But you do have to make reservations at WKAR.org. The program is on the Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer was 50 years ago.
Yes, 50th anniversary.
50th anniversary, and it was really one of the first important movements of the civil rights movement, where many, nearly 1,000 people from northern states went down there to help register votes. They went to Mississippi.
Was that the year of Schwerner and Cheney?
It was.
It was also the year of Viola Liuzzo from Detroit who went down there.
No, I think she was a year later.
Oh, was she a year later?
I think a year later where she was killed.
What about John Lewis at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma?
That would have been later.
That would have been later. Okay, so this was the very beginning.
This was the threshold, I think, and then after that, every year there was something going on in one of the southern states, all the way through probably about 68, 69, where they had educational programs.
You know, it's very hard to remember back to that era, although I was, if it was 50 years ago, I was 20. And so I was a young adult at the time and watched all of this unfold. I didn't have that much context to put it against, but it certainly seemed that it was the beginning of a very violent era in this culture. I mean, between the assassinations of presidents and major leaders and riots in the cities and all of the issues that really surrounded that whole civil rights movement that went on for a decade. It was a decade of enormous turmoil between the civil rights struggle and the Vietnam War.
And a lot of people will tell you one of the things that made the difference was the killing of the three civil rights activists, because two of them were white.
Yeah.
And it made a difference. It's kind of weird, but you probably could have gone killing black people, but as soon as they killed two white people, it got national coverage on television.
Well, and the other thing
Um,
is that you remember back in that era, there were three networks only. There was no cable, and so every night people watched the same news. So when you did see things like people where they unleashed the dogs on them and beat them at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, there was a national revulsion against what happened that I'm not sure what happened today. I mean, it seems we're so fragmented nowadays into so many different niche views that I'm not sure we'd have that same kind of sitting there at the electronic hearth all watch the same news event.
no, Fox would cover it certainly different.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, no, it was important. Everybody after they ate or watched TV while eating.
Yeah, we were talking today that, with the news that's come out over the weekend about the huge flashpoint with the rise of the ISIS taking over northern Iraq, potentially going into Baghdad,
Dang, dang, dang.
the Kurds taking over Kirkuk so that the country is now basically split into three pieces. I think in a previous era, if you with these were the old Vietnam days, you'd have seen people out in the street saying, "Don't go back in. Whatever you, whatever you do, don't bomb." I think it's going to be harder for President Obama to get cover not to bomb, given the fact that I don't see this big uproar in the culture. I think
I,
we're pretty war weary.
oh, we have to be war weary. And, I think you and I talked about it. The New York Times, the front section is the war section. I
Right.
mean, there's so many wars all over the world. It's, they're hard to follow. I mean, there's so
Yeah.
many. I mean, it sort of diminishes your focus.
Years ago, Bob Talbert said to me, he said, the a way that he looked really smart was always to be a half step ahead of the culture. He said, you don't have to be a full step ahead. If you're a half step ahead, you look like a genius. And I remember being among the first, and it was one of those days walking a dog, as I always do, where I thought about the fact that, it looks to me like somehow the middle class life associated with the auto industry, what I thought was permanent progress turned out to be just a blip, a temporary blip that went away. I was surprised at that. And I remember being very surprised at that and coming to that realization fairly early. Well, I was reading over the weekend the Adbusters that I love, and they were talking about the number of people killed in the Civil War, and I was stunned. 600,000 minimum conservative estimate, probably a million or
Yeah,
more, at a
100,000
time
probably.
when we had the population is a mere fraction of what it is now. And I thought, look at all the world wars that we've had, 60 million with World War II. We lost 50,000 in Vietnam. I mean, staggering kinds of numbers. We're very upset about losing, and rightfully so, 4,000 of our soldiers in Iraq and Iran, in Afghanistan. But what if that's the blip? What if we go back to those kinds of numbers? What if we're on the brink of that? I mean, we're seeing so many big conflagrations. I know the number lost in the Iran Iraq war, the first big Iran Iraq war, and we may be on the brink of another one. They lost 1 million people. I mean, we don't even think in those terms anymore. We think that it's a mechanized war with drone strikes and precision bombing, but I'm not so sure that this couldn't be a big one in the Middle East. This is a very dangerous situation.
And the civilians are always the ones to lose, of
Right,
course.
right. That's been the big change with modern warfare. In the Civil War, I mean, that because it occurred in your own country, there were a lot of civilians that got caught up on it. It wasn't just on the battlefield, but the battlefields were horrific.
Oh, absolutely. That was the advent of modern warfare, really.
It is. It is. It's a frightening thought, and I hope that I'm wrong and that we don't see mass conflagration over there, but we certainly seem on the brink of all sorts of problems occurring.
Yeah, that little clock that's close to midnight is.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Well, isn't that just nuclear though?
No, not
No.
for not for me. It isn't. No, it is the nuclear clock. Yeah, that's where it started.
I mean, I agree. On a global scale, it should probably be all things, but
Yeah, I did. I created one once, by the way, and it was very hard to do in Photoshop because you had to do all the minutes. I wasn't smart enough to figure out how to keep moving that little hand, so I had to make all of those, because I wanted a clock like you're talking about that covered everything. We're joined here by, you can hear as the voices in the background, we're joined here by our guest this evening, and now I'm going to move my webcam. We're going to be joined by Todd Haywood, and we are also joined by Dwayne Riley of the Lansing Area AIDS Network and Emily Devendorf of Michigan Equality. And I guess I'm going to start with Emily because of the news that just came out this afternoon. President
Yeah.
Obama did something that did you know, was it expected? Was it on your radar that it was going to happen today or?
It was not on our radar for today. It's been on our radar for years. Um,
We've been asking for years
We
and
have-
being
Hardly
told
a
no.
blip.
we
It's
have been
sustained.
asking for years for him to pass this executive order, and we do believe, of course, that it was the right thing to do, because we do need as many people protected as soon as possible, and it does protect millions of Michigan citizens, and it essentially protects them from discrimination if their employer is a federal contractor.
So it gives the kind of protection to the LGBT community that you've been asking for in Michigan for a long time. You've wanted the revision to the Elliott Larson Employment Act to protect the LGBT community. Now, he can't do it for everybody, but he can do it for the people that work for the federal government.
This was a great example of the president using what power he has. And in this case, he used it to provide employment protections, employment non-discrimination protections for the LGBT community. And that's especially important because we've been waiting for progress on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act at the federal level, and we've been seeing very slow progress on that, although we've been seeing a lot of talks happening, of course. And in Michigan, we've been working for 30 years to amend our state civil rights act, and we do think we're making progress on that as well. But you want to, as I said, make progress in order to protect as many people as soon as possible, because our work is to stop harm.
What does it protect them from? What kinds of discrimination cases do you see?
Well, I like to point out that at Equality Michigan, the majority of our discrimination cases against LGBT citizens are employment discrimination cases. Now, often we hear that there are not enough on record to prove that this is happening, and the reason that employment discrimination cases against LGBT people are not on record is if there is no legal recourse, you are unlikely to come out publicly and say that you're being harassed at work or that your job is in danger, because you are very likely to then absolutely lose your job or be harassed in other ways, or publicly then endanger the possibility of your getting another job, because it's legal for somebody to deny you a job or to fire you from your job for your sexual orientation or gender identity. So right now, when we're living in a place where we don't have protections, you are very unlikely to see people being out in the open about the fact that harm is happening.
Why would you bother? The only consequences could be negative then.
Which is why we see a lot of it internally at the organization, because we have to deal with cleaning up the mess. We have to deal with helping to bring relief to the victim, the survivor of any kind of discrimination, and we have to help to navigate the system in order to try to create stability where there isn't any anymore, and then try to figure out how to work the system without the legal recourse for sexual orientation and gender identity, and see if there are other ways that we can provide legal recourse.
Emily, was there any estimates of the number of workers this covers?
At this point, we can at least say over 1 million. I've heard estimates of millions.
Wow.
Yep.
So it's going to have a real impact.
Yes.
I think it's important to recognize that this executive order will cover every single contractor for the federal government. So Halliburton and ExxonMobil, in fact,
Some of my favorite people.
HRC was actually praising this because it forces ExxonMobil, where shareholders have refused to pass non-discrimination rulings for years, over a decade now, over a decade and a half actually. They're now forced to have to adopt a non-discrimination policy that will include sexual orientation and gender identity because of this executive order.
Well, in particular, too, that we're coming up on the November election, and my understanding from an article in Huffington Post today was that Obama had been signaling to Congress that yes, they had been making progress toward a vote, but they'd been so slow that he was, I guess a week ago, he signaled to some people, you've got a week if you want to look good. And if you don't look good within a week, then I'm going to announce the order, which is probably not a bad carrot and stick arrangement to try to get something to move. But I just think it's going to be difficult to get progress on much prior to this election.
Yeah, I do appreciate that he announces that he intends to use the power of his pen when he has the opportunity to, and we don't see that all the time. But in this case, we did, and it will provide very, very strong relief for a lot of LGBT citizens.
Who administers that program?
I believe
each
the Office of
agency-
Civil Rights will
Rights.
do that, in the
Yeah.
Department of Justice.
Each
Yes.
person who gets a contract has to sign that form
Yep.
that talks about, how that they are in compliance with all of the diversity requirements out of the EEOC.
Mm.
And I think it's more a case where once you do that, if you violate it, you're going to end up with a case there. I think that's how that would probably
Would
work.
it include universities
Oh, absolutely.
which
Yeah.
take, grants?
Well, the majority of universities, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the majority of universities actually have non-discrimination policies that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. It's really the private businesses
Private sector.
that have been a continuing problem. And so it's nice to see this, although I think it's also important to acknowledge that this was also part of Obama saying, okay, I'm done waiting for Congress to move on ENDA.
Mhm.
And there's a huge problem with ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, in Congress right now. A lot of the national LGBT organizations have real concerns about it because there's a religious exemption in the law that would allow an employer to discriminate because somebody's sexual orientation violates their personal religious beliefs.
Well, I think we still have 14 Supreme Court decisions that have 2 weeks to be announced, and one of them will be whether corporations have a religious exemption at the corporate level, and that's going to be an interesting one. That could certainly have a huge impact. In fact, including even no matter what his executive order is,
Yeah.
whatever they decide there, it will have an impact on that.
Absolutely.
Have we heard any kind of rumblings out of the court of what to expect?
I'm not sure what to expect out of that particular ruling, but I do know that the threat of religious exemptions being inserted into public policies and obviously being granted validity by court rulings is, I don't think it's a new thing, but it certainly is something that is being recognized more as necessary when we absolutely know that it is not.
There was an end run, I thought, starting a few years ago, where many things got sort of snuck into laws. We saw, for example, the Hyde Amendment. I was never quite sure. I think that they felt, well, gee, if we give the other side one, we'll get them off our back for a while. No, you don't. You have emboldened the other side to go for more. And I think this recasting of the argument as religious freedom rather than religious dictates is an interesting one because, I mean, it is that, Orthodox Jews don't eat pork, but that doesn't mean that they're going to stop me. I'm a vegetarian. I wouldn't do it anyhow, but most people from eating bacon.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not that they're going to be able to take bacon off the shelves, nor would they want to if they owned a. We see that many religious organizations actually own the ground that supermarkets are on. That doesn't mean they dictate the terms of what is sold there based on their dietary laws. And I think it's unfortunate, and I'm hoping that the Supreme Court affirms that kind of decision because, boy, if they don't, after Citizens United, I think we're going to see a very different country.
I think it's interesting to acknowledge as well that when we start talking about these religious exemptions, we saw the Arizona bill, we saw the Mississippi bill that were trying to legislate religious exemptions on discrimination against LGBT people in marriage, and the states universally rejected those. There was a pretty clear statement from the politicians and the people. This is an unacceptable choice for us. And I think that that's a sea change for LGBT equality issues in this country. I think if we'd had this conversation 5 years ago, the whole construct of religious freedom would be still up in the air about whether that was an acceptable construct in American culture.
There's ironies because we do have a subculture. In Michigan, they're fairly strong. I went to that hearing of about 300 people that were worried about Sharia law being imposed, right?
That was a Dave Agema thing.
It was, and he was there in full force, and I was busy there videoing, and everybody was agitated that was going to happen any moment. But if you go through some of the sections of the Bible, there is stoning to death for adultery and things like that. I mean, basically, we're talking about fundamentalist law at a certain level, regardless of the religion involved. But it seems to me that those are very dangerous precepts to start changing years of settled law. I'm concerned where that could lead us with the progress that we're making.
Well, I think that one foundation of the religious exemption movement that allows it to continue is that it's not looking long term. It's a reactionary movement.
Yeah.
It's to try to hold the power in place where it is right now, because you can't look at religious exemptions and the giant loopholes that they create and see rationale in that, because in the end, a religious exemption creates a loophole, a void so big that it enables the policy to harm those who are also trying to pass that public policy.
Does that mean that if I'm a profound coward, I don't have to serve in the military? I mean, no.
No.
Now, here's an interesting thing. Several years ago, the state was debating a religious exemption for counselors.
Right.
And Senator Tupac Hunter, a Democrat from Detroit, had introduced and sponsored that legislation. And I interviewed him and I said, so based on this bill, if I'm an adherent to Christian identity faith, which is a white nationalist Christian supremacy argument, I would have the right to refuse.
Passages in the Bible.
I would have the right to refuse to provide counseling services to people of color because that violates my. Well, no, I wouldn't go that far. Well,
how could you
according to this, you're giving everybody based on their firmly held religious beliefs the right to discriminate. So you can't pick and choose which faith system somebody uses. And he hung up on me.
Yeah. Well,
so I think
as a pastafarian in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, there are various things in that church you are not going to like. We have only begun to talk about those. First of all, everybody's going to have to paint their car like mine. There are a few little quirks like that you hadn't realized about my church.
Asterisks.
Property values will go down if you paint your homes and your cars to meet mine. One of the cases I need to say that this is WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan, LCC radio. There was another case that I read about just this afternoon. It's a young man named Chase Culpepper, and he is a transgender young man who was wearing makeup, right? And he went in to get his driver's license in South Carolina, and they said, we will not give you your driver's license, and we will not take your picture unless you washed your makeup off. Which I just think, because he was listed as biologically male on the birth certificate that he brought in, they demanded that he do that before he could receive his driver's license. And thinking back to teenage years, how extraordinarily and exquisitely sensitive you are. You really are. Teenagers are going through a really tumultuous period in all of our lives. What a horrible thing for the state to have done to that young man. And, will a law like this ultimately, this only covers employment we're looking at for these issues. What is it going to take to get this kind of problem stopped?
Well, in terms of just discriminating against the transgender community and expression and ID issues, and we have so many policies to change in Michigan. We do, don't we? Yeah, so for amending Elliott Larson, we also need to make sure that gender identity and expression continue to be included in the amendment. That's going to be something that cannot be on the negotiating table. So as we continue to talk about it this year, that should be something that stays at the top of our minds, and stays a part of the discussion. We should continue asking if it's still a part of the policy, and we should be looking into making sure that we are creating routes for a transgender individual to have easier access to an ID. It only benefits all of us for us to have legal ID on us. And we make it so hard, but it's also dehumanizing. It's dehumanizing for no good reason.
Right.
Well, could they have done that in Michigan?
Yes,
Yes,
absolutely. In
thought,
fact, they do it all the time.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge that without ID, that represents who you present as. So if I'm transgender and I present as a woman, but my ID shows me as a man, it's really hard to get a job. You're more likely to get harassed if you get pulled over by the police. You're more likely to get trouble when you get into a store and you're buying cigarettes or alcohol or anything else that you need to be ID'd for.
You can't.
You're going to have all kinds of issues, and yet our current Secretary of State, Ruth Johnson, refuses to address the current status. You have to, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you have to, in order to have your gender marker changed, you actually have to have a transition surgery.
You have to have your doctor say that you have had medical procedures done in order to change your gender. And
very, very few transgender folks actually do the full procedure.
Not everybody wants to, and we should really only have to do what we want to do. Gender expression and identity is a very personal thing, and really rather arbitrary in terms of how we should be treated and what access we should have to rights and opportunities.
One of the bigger offenders in my mind are journalists because I see AP style falling so far behind so often
Yeah.
in the way in which we use language in a variety of different situations related to diversity. Todd, you were at a conference recently that addressed some of these issues related to the use of language by journalists and
Yeah.
all of the different terminology. What did you learn there that we need to think about?
Well, I don't think it's something that I learned there per se, but it's certainly a topic of discussion,
Yeah.
particularly with the transgender community right now. It's really disempowering to have somebody try and tell your story, but misidentify your gender or, really screw up your gender constructs. And that's not fair. And as journalists, we're supposed to be striving to tell the truth. How are you telling the truth when somebody identifies as a woman, lives their life as a woman, and you identify them as a him?
Right.
I remember covering the story of Julie Nemechek, who was fired by Spring Arbor University because she was transgender. And there were multiple stories where they kept referring to her as him. And that's one of the things that Gary Glenn does from the American Family Association. Whenever he talks about Julie's case, he talks about David Nemechek, which is her former, and refers to him as a man in a dress, and really is denigrating. And we see that issue across the board whenever the issue of gender identity comes up as a legal construct. And I think you fought some of that down well, with all these equal rights ordinances that have been passed, but particularly in Royal Oak, we saw some things about how it's a man in a dress is going to go in the bathroom and rape little girls. I mean, that's the new meme, the bathroom meme. And it's really difficult to counter that meme, even though there's never been a single case.
Right.
It's still brought out because it pulls on all the fear
Feeds into that
constructs
whole
that
thing.
everybody wants to play with. And so it's really hard to counter that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not a new meme. It's such an old meme, and so successful in how it plays on fear, on irrational fear, that it is the argument that's used across the country. It's the ploy that the opposition uses is what we call the bathroom panic argument.
I have a certain frustration because when we teach journalism, we are to use the AP style book as a sort of Bible. And so that's a real problem when they do lag behind the rest of the culture. For a long time, they were still doing illegal alien, for example, with people who come over the border. I mean, so, and they've always been a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator.
Are you allowed to use the supplements that are provided by the National Gay and Lesbian Journalists Association and by GLAAD?
Well, see, what happens is that most news organizations, I think, need to be hammered more by those organizations to make sure that they acknowledge them, because the easiest thing to do, I mean, every good publication that I've ever worked for has had its own style book. Rather, here are the places where we deviate from what AP style dictates because we don't think that they're as relevant. But it's very easy to just fall back on that, and a lot of places do, especially in the digital world. I think they just grab that and they make that the end all be all determinant.
And I think it's laziness
Oh, I
on
do
the
too.
part of the news agencies.
One of
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
One of the roles of Equality Michigan that a lot of people don't know about is to try to get out in front of that, and we go to meet with editorial boards and let them know the kind of damage that can be done by writing about it incorrectly or in a way that can be interpreted as disrespectful or dehumanizing. And then as soon as we see a story come out that does refer to a member of the LGBT community in a way that might be degrading or dehumanizing, then it's our responsibility to call and get it corrected and do that damage control and make sure that we are working with whoever is affected by that story immediately, because it is not just about language, of course, for us. It really translates into real harm for the transgender community. We see it resulting in not just feelings of isolation and discrimination in the job arena or bullying in schools, but for African American trans women, we end up seeing that particular population as being disproportionately affected by hate crimes, being the number one victim of violent bias crimes. And that's a regular thing we see as an organization and as LGBT communities.
Talk about that incident in Detroit.
Yes, and just we of course we were reminded again, unfortunately, that as we make progress, as momentum builds, that resistance to the momentum of equality also builds and pushes back in really violent ways. And we saw that on June 8th. This last Sunday, it was the end of the second day of Motor City Pride, and Motor City Pride is the biggest Pride festival in Michigan and Detroit. And we had just wrapped up the second day, and at record-breaking numbers, wonderful community, and out on the Riverwalk, just east of where Motor City Pride takes place at Hart Plaza, a, a, a member of the LGBT community, and now he's public, so now we can say his name, but Christian was walking down the Riverwalk and taking pictures with his friend. And a group of young men saw him, confronted him, started to egg him on, and hate speech was used, and he ended up getting thrown to the ground and beaten pretty badly, and
Very
with without bystanders stepping in, and somebody did get it on tape. He ended up with a broken hand and an injured eye, and he did end up reporting this to the police. We have, over the last week or so, been able to, with the police's help and with the help of the public, identify some of the people that were a part of that attack. But this is another reminder that we also need to amend our state's Ethnic Intimidation Act.
Yes.
Because it's another situation where in Michigan we don't have legal recourse at the state level to address this particular crime. We are not included as protected classes under our Ethnic Intimidation Act, whereas everybody else, for the most part, generally is. And we would have to take this to the federal government to have it designated as a hate crime, and even then, we would have to fit certain very specific criteria. So we still have yet to see if we will be able to do that. And the Detroit Police Department is being very, very great in working with us on this particular.
What was the reaction of the mayor? Did he have a public reaction? I couldn't remember if I saw one.
I'm not aware of one.
I didn't think I saw one.
That's unfortunate.
It is,
Mhm.
yeah.
And the
Because
chief of
that happened
police-
right adjacent to the not the Ren Center, what do they call it, the GM building now?
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7. We're talking about LGBT issues and a broad spectrum of them with Emily Devendorf of Equality Michigan, with Todd Haywood, and also with Dwayne Riley of the Lansing Area AIDS Network. You know, I was talking about press treatment. One of the things I saw over the weekend was that Chelsea Manning, who had previously been known to many people as Sergeant Bradley Manning, who's been convicted of releasing a lot of classified information to WikiLeaks, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. But there were references periodically when that was made to that were really sort of dismissive, or
Formerly known as.
And, you know, I mean, really not trying to identify him as, you know, this is how the context you will know him, but sort of, I mean, first of all, that it disparages the points he was trying to make. And what I thought, I mean, here's a man who's going to be doing 35 years in federal prison for what he did, and there are many people who believe that what he did was whistleblowing and not a violation of the Espionage Act, as and military justice is a different creature. But it really makes it difficult because it's just treated as his word is not worth as much as other people. It's a question of privilege, I guess.
And what was quite interesting to me reading that is she actually said, yeah, what I did was wrong. I can see that. Okay, fine. But here's why I did it, and here's what it means, and here's what's going on. And people clamped on to, well, he was formerly Bradley Manning, and like that had anything to do with what she was talking about. It
Right.
really doesn't. And I even saw a couple of reports where they referred to her as he again, and I was just like, really? You're going to denigrate her that much? I mean, she has made it clear. She is Chelsea Manning. She's a woman.
Right.
Who am I as a reporter to make the decision that she doesn't get to identify that way and that I get to choose the pronouns for her?
Well, apparently Governor Rick Perry, who is apparently running for president again, might decide that there was a way to, quote unquote, maybe repair her. Is that what he would say?
Yeah, as soon as he stops eating corn dogs at the fairs, I'll accept that as an issue to discuss.
We have seen this sort of new line of reasoning now, where he compared being gay to having, because now that there is talking about it being genetic. He wanted to say, well, I may have a gene for alcoholism, but that doesn't mean that I give in to the impulse,
Yeah.
which is a really sort of nasty way of trying to twist the argument again and put in one more go round.
It's not new.
No.
No, this has been an
No.
ongoing comparison to uh, alcoholism, drug addiction. I mean, these are all things that LGBT people are compared to on a regular basis, and it's a way to create a disease construct around
Right.
us, to make us less than,
Yes.
which makes it easier to dehumanize. That's ultimately that's the goal. As long as they can dehumanize us, they can continue to use us as an enemy, which prevents us from being able to have access gains for our own equality. And we see that over and over and over again from the far right.
Well, one of the things that, that I was trying to get at earlier is that there is this whole panoply of laws. I mean, it seems like there should be some one swift way, to get all of that changed. But we're seeing, even in a situation like same-sex marriage right now, people are living in limbo here in the state of Michigan. I mean, it is such a confused situation. Where are we now with that issue here in Michigan? And what are the things that are on the timeline that we know are coming up that could have the ability to rectify the situation?
Well, in Michigan, we now have over 300 couples, over 600 people who are recognized by the federal government and receiving some federal benefits, and who just had a very confusing tax season. And
As if that isn't bad enough to begin with.
yes, yes. So they have formed a very supportive, tight-knit community just to stay on top of what rights they do and don't have, because it changes so quickly on a weekly basis. Those 300 plus couples in Michigan. We are hoping.
We also have an additional group of people who've been married in other states who have moved here.
Yep.
And are they in the same category?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Their rights are being respected and recognized by the federal government.
But not Michigan.
But not Michigan, because
So-
Governor Snyder says that while those marriages are technically legal, they're not being recognized for the purposes of providing any government benefits. So those rights, that recognition is on hold until this whole case is resolved. And right now, that means that we have to wait until at least August 6th. We just found out today that August 6th, that our case, DeBoer versus Snyder, will be at 1:00 p.m. In the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that's in Ohio. And we will be one of many cases heard that day. We do expect for there to be a good result from that, but it still is just a couple of steps down a very long road. So we have done a couple of different things. Those 300 plus couples know that they are waiting, that they will be waiting for a while.
Now, if the Sixth District Court overturns and says, no, these are legal, and can there be another injunction at that level? We would anticipate that Attorney General Bill Schuette, who has been adamant on this issue, will ask for an injunction. Do we know anything about the Sixth Circuit Court and what they might or might not be likely to do?
Yes, as of right now, of course, there's a stay until resolution at that point.
Right.
So that could be lifted.
Okay.
And as you said, the Attorney General would then ask that a stay be placed until there is a resolution at the next step. And we're not
Which would
sure.
be the Supreme Court.
Right.
Well, actually, he can ask for an en blanc, which means the entire Circuit Court of Appeals.
Okay.
So he can ask for the entire court. He's actually already asked for that.
And
The
been
court said,
denied.
No,
Yeah.
No, we're not doing
Yeah.
go to the 3-panel first.
Yeah. So
Okay.
he's already been denied that. This particular court does not lean terribly conservative, from what we know. This is the one court that has not been reached and has not been able to be pushed far right. So we feel okay about the way that they're looking at this and their ability to reason this, and we think that might be why they might have not been granted that when the Attorney General requested en blanc the first time.
I think it's en banc.
En banc.
I don't think there's an L in it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that word, that funny, strange word.
Yeah, that's en banc. So because it is going to take so long, we have started another effort to work alongside this particular one. We've started Michigan for Marriage, and that is a project that we started with the National ACLU and National Freedom to Marry. And that is a statewide public education campaign where we are really putting forth a very intentional effort to have Michigan citizens get to know us, our families, and when I say that, I don't mean just LGBT people. I mean our parents, I mean our children, our employers, so that if we have to go to the ballot by this time next year, when we announce we have to go to the ballot, people will feel accountable to us. People will want to get off their sofa and do that because they know exactly what harm there is, and that they already know us, love us, and appreciate who we are and the work that we do.
Well, one of the things we learned from the civil union laws that were passed in some states was that marriage is much more all encompassing. You can pass a civil union law, but it doesn't cover things like,
Right.
do I get to go in and spend time with somebody when they're dying if I'm not a family? Those kinds of regulations that exist in various places. One of the questions I've never understood is, where do those people who have civil unions now stand in a state like Michigan where marriage may be illegal? Are there civil unions accepted?
Not
Not at
right
all.
now for Michigan. No.
No, because remember, we have what's called a super mini DOMA in our
I
Constitution,
see.
which prohibits us from recognizing marriage between people of the same gender or any other union
Oh.
that's similar.
Oh, so there's little.
So that's where the argument against domestic partner benefits has come from.
Oh,
That's
I see.
so that's where we run into some real issues. Is we have that super mini DOMA.
One
is really
man,
weird.
one woman,
That's
any
it.
relationship, yes. That is.
Now, is there a case percolating up to the Supreme Court, which at a certain point, regardless of what's happening with the Michigan case, could be so much of a blanket decision that we would see this issue finally decided? And if so, which case is that, and what is it on the timetable? Do we
We
see
really
one on the
don't know.
horizon?
Everybody's so split on that. We still think that there will have to be a couple of cases just because we have to
More than one.
work out so many details.
Okay.
Yes, but there are still tens of cases across the country that need to go through appeals court, and covering different points. The reason that we have some faith in Michigan perhaps getting further in the process is because we were forced to go through a trial, and because the Attorney General insisted on defending our constitutional ban, and in other states they have not been that resistant to change or blind.
Have we known what this has cost us as a state? In other words, I've talked to couples who've said, I really will do one out of here. And this is just too unsettled, and there's other states that are far more welcoming. Is there any way to quantify the kind of impact that it's had? It's so difficult to do, I would think.
Not yet. Just that it's a regular story that we hear. When we started collecting stories about why marriage equality matters in Michigan, I know that we expected as an organization and as a marriage movement to hear a lot about wanting to raise our kids with more structure, and wanting to pledge our love to our partner, and wanting to have the legal stability to be able to stay together. I don't think I even expected to get as many emails and stories as I did that said, I'm not going to have kids because I don't have the stability that marriage needs to provide, or I'm not staying in the state because of this, or
Yeah.
more so, I've already left. I
Yeah.
gave up 2 years ago. And those were part of this wave of responses to me about why marriage equality matters in Michigan. When I was expecting a lot of beautiful stories about why we want this, I got also a lot of stories about this is why my life is stalled, or
Yeah.
I've given up on my life happening in Michigan.
I can understand that. I mean, how many years will people wait? And the path isn't that clear from here. I mean, how many more years will we have to wait?
Well, I think, and this is just me looking from my armchair, I do think that Michigan's case is most likely to hit the Supreme Court.
You think it might be one of the determining ones?
Because right now it's one of the only ones that has a full trial transcript, and that trial's a pretty stunning document. Frankly, if you read those transcripts, it's just stunning what was testified to by the state's experts. I'm still shocked by that.
Stunning in how weak their argument was,
Yeah.
and yet it represents the prevailing argument of
Yeah.
our opposition. So whether
Well, they
it's a
had the
good
resources
argument
to
or
give
not.
the best argument.
Oh
that
yeah, they had the
Absolutely.
resources. They spent lots of money on their witnesses. Those are their experts, and they're terrible.
They're so bad that the judge actually
Yeah.
said that he couldn't give any credibility to any of those witnesses.
It was a
think
scathing decision.
it was absolutely a scathing decision. But I think the fact that we have that puts us in line to be probably the leading state for a Supreme Court ruling.
Do we know what will happen at the Supreme Court level? I mean, we all assume
No.
that once it gets there, we are assured of the fact that this is going to be an enlightened decision from the perspective of the LGBT community. And I don't know anymore. When I look at this court, it just,
I would say otherwise.
you would think otherwise?
I would
Five
lean
Catholics.
that it's probably 55% in favor of legalizing same-sex marriage across the U.S., but I still think there's a high probability that it could go the other way. I mean, we really could have had some sort of test image going on with the Prop 8 case, the Perry case, but they really ruled very narrowly on that case and tossed it back down, saying there was nobody here to challenge it, there's no standing, move on. So we really don't have a sense of exactly how this court sees marriage equality in the bigger picture. We don't even have that in Windsor. We have a very narrow, again, ruling in Windsor looking at one section of the Defense of Marriage Act and not the rest of them. So I think there's a possibility this court could say,
Well, one of the other things that's been happening recently, by the way, this is LCC radio. Whoops, I'm getting a little feedback here. Whoa.
Something's happening.
Something's happening. This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing. We can't move it that far away, Todd, or we'll never hear you, because we want to find out for you. You're newly back from Grinnell, Iowa.
I am. Lovely Grinnell.
The lovely big city of Grinnell.
Actually, it was a lovely town.
Was it? Oh.
Yeah, it was. It was very nice.
And you were out there on the issue of HIV criminalization.
That's right.
And there was a welcome decision in that case.
Yes, there was. Last Friday, the Iowa Supreme Court set aside a conviction, actually the sentence, for a man named Nick Rhodes. Nick Rhodes in 2009 met a man on the internet. They met, they had sex. Nick is HIV positive. He used a condom. He had an undetectable viral load. Every scientist and medical expert that's been consulted said the probability that he would transmit the virus was 0. And yet he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison in Iowa.
Wow.
That was a year later, that was reduced to 5 years on probation and suspended sentence of 25 years. But he also had to be on the sex offender registry in Iowa as a top tier registered sex offender, which required him to undergo polygraphs every 3 months. He had to have a GPS monitor on his ankle all the time. He was not allowed to be around any minor children ever, and anybody who allowed a minor child to be left with him alone committed a crime. So his family couldn't leave like his nieces and nephews with him or anything like that. This was for consensual sex without transmission of HIV.
How did that ever come to the attention of the authority?
The gentleman who was the victim went to the hospital to get post-exposure prophylaxis, which is the use of anti-HIV medications to prevent infection after an exposure. And the hospital called the police, just as they would in a rape victim situation.
Now, did they feel that they were under a reporting requirement, or was the law written in a way that they were?
They were not under a reporting requirement, but they felt that they were.
Okay.
And you know, I get torn a little bit there because I do think that modern medicine does need to take some steps to address domestic violence that's happening and sexual assault that's happening. And if somebody is a victim of intentional transmission, I think we can all agree that the intentional transmitter should face some criminal action. Unfortunately, we're not talking about intentional transmission. We're talking about people who don't disclose their HIV status, who are being sent to prison for 5, 10, 15, 25 years. You know, we at the conference, we got to meet a gentleman from Idaho Same scenario, undetectable viral load, use a condom, there was no transmission. He's serving 30 years in prison.
Unbelievable.
Here in
And at the same time, one of the things, I mean, looked at from the other situation as well, is we want people to get PrEP, right?
Correct.
We want them to get
that's
the
pre-exposure
treatment,
prophylaxis.
yes, that would allow them to be able to be secure, that they have taken all the steps necessary to ensure that they're not going to be infected with the virus, and you want them to be able to have access to that.
That's right.
But this would make people, I would think, much more reluctant to ever go in and.
We actually have some studies that actually show that HIV criminalization reduces the testing and the willingness to test for those who are most at risk for HIV infection. A small minority of that group is less likely to get tested for HIV because the ultimate defense in these HIV criminalization laws is not knowing your status.
Right.
The minute you know your status, you're now subject to these felony laws. And here in Michigan, it's a 4-year felony to have sex without disclosure. You can share a needle while HIV positive. That is not a felony, but it is a felony to have sexual penetration, quote, however slight, end quote, without disclosure.
You're working with the Lansing Area and AIDS Network in order to try to get the word out on PrEP and other, other information about what's available in the community for people
Right.
to be able to have access to these drugs.
Well, let's take a step back and actually explain what PrEP is, because I think that's really important as to what's going on. PrEP was approved 2 years ago by the FDA, and what it is the use of a drug named Truvada, which is a combination of 2 anti-HIV drugs that has been shown to prevent HIV transmission. How effective is it? If it's taken every day as prescribed, it is 99% effective. It is more effective than any other prevention option that we have available in the United States. If it's taken only 4 times a week, it's 92% effective in preventing transmission. That is still more effective than any other prevention option that we have in the United States. The CDC just recently released a brand new clinical guidance making PrEP much more accessible to a larger range of people who are at risk for HIV, really broadened out the categories. In fact, according to the New York Times, it could expand access to the prescription to over 500,000 people who are at risk of HIV infection.
Is it mandated and available under all of the policies covered under Obamacare now?
From my understanding, it is covered by all insurance companies, but we're running into problems with co-pays. And I think Dwayne can talk a little bit about that.
I think currently the average copay for Truvada is about $200. It's about $200 a month. The medication itself is $13,000 a year. And so with Gilead, that's a company that makes Truvada. They'll cover those particular expenses right there at 100%. Of course, you have to meet specific requirements as far as income levels and things of that nature. But the medication is absolutely available to any and everyone who wants it and who needs it. I think that it's so important to actually get the word out there. At our agency, we test lots of individuals, each and every year, and it's such a huge portion of the individuals in which we test. They have no idea what PrEP is.
Right.
Even some of the highest risk individuals that come into our agency, they simply have no idea what PrEP is and how effective it can be at reducing their particular risk for HIV. And so we continue to have those new incidents of HIV infection, which can be avoidable if we actually get that information out there, get people signed up to PrEP, talk to physicians who are working with individuals who are at high risk to educate them exactly on what PrEP is. Because some, there's some medical professionals who won't prescribe the medication.
Is that again a religious exemption?
I don't think
No,
so.
it's more of a sense of not feeling like they're qualified to prescribe this medication because HIV medications have this reputation of being incredibly dangerous to the body and having all these terrible side effects, and you need to do all these tests to make sure the body's okay. Truvada, however, has been proven to be very safe as a preventative. In fact, in the trials that were done, there were 2,499 men who have sex with men in 4 different countries that were part of this trial for 2 years. The side effects that they were able to document were nausea, which went away in about 3 weeks. And the other thing they documented in very few cases, like less than 7 from what I understand, was some elevated kidney issues. And as soon as the people stopped using the drug, the kidney functions went back to normal. No other problems.
Well, are we seeing, for example, that you can get your Viagra with no copay, but you can't get your Truvada? Is that kind of where it stands?
I don't know.
I don't think you
Not
can
sure
get
about the
Viagra
Viagra.
without copay. Do you?
Yeah, sure you can. Oh, that's what, I mean, I think that was one of the issues that the women raised when they were talking about not being able to get their contraception covered, but Viagra is covered under all the Obamacare and all the
Well, I
other
think there's
policies.
probably still a copay,
Maybe a
but
little copay. The other issue for me is that drug companies have been gouging. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't care what kind of drug it is, 13,000 a year. I look at the chemotherapy drugs that are, you know, $50,000, $100,000 a year. I mean, they're just astronomical drug costs. It seems that we need to do something to make those free.
Mhm.
We see that in other countries, for example, I was reading of a study today where they're finding out that women in Africa who take the same drug in order to prevent transmission to their children,
Mhm.
you know, that's a very effective means, but it's certainly not, the government is not paying it at that rate.
Mhm.
I mean, they're getting a discount. So one of the issues we have to do is figure out some way to persuade the drug companies to make the prices lower, I would think.
now here's the thing that's going on with that.
Okay.
For treatment, the federal government has developed the AIDS Drug Assistance Program, which is funded in all 50 states and the territories. We did go through a stage in 2007, 2008 where we had some waiting lists, but those have been dealt with under the Obama administration. But those pay for those drugs.
But that's corporate welfare, and we're giving it to
Well,
the drug
actually, it's
company.
not. In Michigan, for instance, about half of our actual $50 million that's spent on ADAP is actually money that's given, is rebate money from the drug company. So the drug company is actually paying us
Oh.
a significant chunk of the money for funding the program,
But they get the other half.
but they get the other half. So it's really for
Mm.
them it's a revenue neutral
I see.
proposal.
That's an odd one.
It is odd, but it is working, and nobody is not getting access to the drugs that needs them.
Mhm.
The problem is finding out about them.
That's
That's the first
The
thing.
information.
And what is your organization doing to make that happen?
Well, we're one of the things that we're doing is definitely getting more training on what PrEP is. We're training all of our staff, of course, about PrEP and different ways to basically promote that information right there. We're also teaming with Prep For It Now, which is the campaign that Todd can talk to you guys more about. But that's going to be for National Test Day, which will be June 28th. That's going to be from 4 p.m. to midnight. We'll be there all day long giving out PrEP screenings. We're also going to be providing comprehensive HIV testing and counseling. Well,
What location?
it's going to be at 1310 Turner Street, and that's in Old Town.
Okay.
So we'll be canvassing the area, doing different things there just to promote the services that we're going to be
What
providing.
location is that on Turner Street?
That's the Diversity Psychological Services building.
Okay.
But we'll be also in Spiral and Esquire Bar as well.
Okay, good.
We're gonna have a bingo game going on. We're gonna have some trivia going on. I think we're talking about some relay races with
Yeah.
condoms filled with water.
Now, you had a very successful Twitter campaign going at
We
one
did.
point,
It's,
you previously?
hashtag test me. We were able to get 2.5 million views. We put that
Wow.
together last year in 10 days at the Netroots Nation LGBT Pre-Connect event. We had 2 former presidential candidates endorse the campaign. The White House pushed it, the Red Project pushed it, and we're pushing it again this year. You're going to see Test Me 2014 go big as well.
Is it going to be that same date, June 28th?
We'll be doing it in the same period, yep.
Will you have Netroots in Detroit in the meanwhile so that you can connect?
Netroots is in Detroit in next month, so we won't be able to do it in advance.
In advance, but okay.
But we will also have the
that was
prep.
wildly successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
also have the Prep For It event, which I think is going to be incredibly helpful.
And now, Dwayne, any last things that people need to know? There's some PSAs coming too, I gather, right? That are going to be trying to get the word out to the community.
Yes, we'll be launching those next week, correct?
We're hoping June 19th. So
June
Okay,
19th?
so in a
Is
couple
there a
days.
website people could go to?
the website we're hoping will be available on June 19th is Prep For It, the numeral 4, itnow.com. Prep,
Prep For It?
P-R-E-P, numeral 4, it prepforitnow.com.
prepforitnow.com.
Mhm.
Sounds wonderful. I want to thank Todd Haywood and Emily Dievendorf and Dwayne Riley and of the Lansing Area AIDS Network, and also Emily from the Equality Michigan. We've learned a lot this evening, but we've devoted the whole hour to this topic, and I still have the feeling we've only scratched the surface, and we could easily go another hour. So we're going to have you back soon to give us a wrap up on all the legal issues, all the cultural issues, all the health issues. This is just such an important topic, and thank you so much for coming in and giving us this information. I want to remind everybody that that's June 28th from 4 to midnight in Old Town. If you go there, then I'm sure somebody will direct you to a place where you can be tested. So that is important. This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. You've been listening to Lansing Online News Radio with Bonnie Buckaroo and Bill Castanero, and we'll see you next Monday night at 7 p.m.